through military spending, R&D, creating a state-guaranteed market.
Precisely. The source labels it public subsidy and private profit, and argues other industrial societies are basically similar.
So the idea of a pure free market is, from this perspective, a kind of myth, used to justify policies that benefit private power.
That's the claim. And this framework gets applied to free trade deals like NAFTA and GET.
Looking at NAFTA, the source argued its main effect would be, what? Accelerating job movement to Mexico.
To exploit low wages, lack of union rights, it mentions organizers being killed and unregulated pollution, making Mexico, quote, a great place for investors.
It notes there was significant opposition, though, in the U.S., from labor, pro, public opinion.
And in Mexico, too. Unions, environmental groups, even the Mexican Bishops' Conference echoing concerns about neoliberal reforms and their impact, like on indigenous groups in Chiapas.
And GAVTT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the focus on intellectual property rights.
The source argues this was designed to keep future tech locked down by multinational corporations,
Preventing countries like India from making cheap generic drugs. It uses Merck as an example.
Yeah, pointing out Merck itself relied heavily on public research, and noting the Indian parliament initially rejected those stricter patent rules.
A really significant point raised is the growth of unregulated financial capital.
Huge shift. By 1990, maybe 90% speculative versus only 10% in 1970, according to the source.
In this huge pool of speculative money, the argument goes, pressures governments towards deflationary policies.
Low growth, low inflation,
Aha.
driving the world towards a low growth, low wage equilibrium, making it hard for governments to stimulate, like Clinton's package being shot down.
There's a stark comparison made about wealth transfer, too.
Yeah, contrasting estimated Soviet aid to Eastern Europe in the 70s, maybe $80 billion.
With wealth flowing from Latin America to the West in the 80s, $150 billion officially, maybe $700 billion total.
And the source links that outflowed directly to the poverty, malnutrition, state terror, collapsing living standards in Latin America during that debt crisis era.
The source also looks at post-Cold War Eastern Europe,
Arguing it's basically being turned into a new exploitable part of the global South, reestablishing a kind of colonial relationship with Western Europe, especially Germany.
a race for robbery and exploitation between Europe, Japan, and the U.S.
That's the phrase used. And it even mentions a racist angle the source claims exists in investor preference for, white populations there over others.
And finally, this section ties these economic policies directly to human cost.
Contrasting Brazil's infant mortality with poorer places like Sri Lanka or China, quoting activists about millions lacking necessities in resource-rich Latin America.
And mentioning UNESCO reports linking Eastern Europe's reforms to increased child mortality.
Right. So the argument is the economic system isn't some natural free market. It's constructed, enforced, concentrating wealth and power.
Often with devastating consequences, especially for the global South and former Soviet states.
Which leads us very neatly into the source's analysis of power itself, specifically focusing on corporations.
And it makes this really strong, almost jarring claim, describing corporations as about as close to strict totalitarian structures as any human institutions are.
Yeah, arguing their internal structure, command and control, is more totalitarian than many political systems.
Their aims are clear, according to the source. Maximize profit, power, market share, control over the state.
Any benefits to the population are just accidental side effects.
This connects to that idea of socializing costs while privatizing profits.
Right. Examples like the public paying for plutonium cleanup or environmental damage being an externality for investors in Thailand or China. The company doesn't bear the cost. Society does.
And this corporate power heavily influences government policy, insulating it from public opinion.
The U.S. healthcare example is used here. Public wanted universal healthcare for ages.
But it only became politically realistic when corporations, like auto companies facing higher costs than competitors in Canada, pushed for change due to inefficiency.
Exactly. And it cites Vicente Navarro linking universal healthcare historically to working-class strength.
The source even brings in Adam Smith. Arguing Smith himself pointed out mercantilism benefited merchants and manufacturers, the principal architects of policy, but harmed the people.
Yeah, saying class analysis was just taken for granted in his work, understanding different economic interests.
A key point is that corporations aren't self-sufficient. They depend heavily on governments.
The source claims every Fortune 100 transnational benefited from home country industrial policy. Over 20 wouldn't have survived without bailouts or subsidies.
Like the Boeing McDonnell Douglas merger subsidy,
Yeah,
and the Pentagon wanting access to their tech.
right. And corporate executives, the source argues they aren't necessarily bad people, but their job requires them to maximize profit.
Which can mean paying starvation wages or terrible conditions, like in Indonesia. The problem is the system, the job itself.
That's the argument. Question the structure, not just the individuals within it.
This influence extends even to infrastructure, like destroying public transport in LA.
Yeah, shifting to cars and trucks, helped by massive government highway programs benefiting auto and oil industries.
And finally, it characterizes the business community and top planners as rabidly class-conscious.
Worried about the rising aspirations of the common man, while promoting the idea for everyone else that there is no class, we're all equal, living in harmony.
So this paints a picture where corporate power isn't just economic, it actively shapes politics, society, perception, dependent on the state, while promoting a free market ideology.
And that idea of shaping perception leads directly into the source's analysis of democracy, media, and what it calls indoctrination.
Right. It talks about a doctrinal meaning versus a dictionary meaning for words like democracy.
Yes, the doctrinal meaning, in this view, used within powerful institutions, is a system where elites, business sectors, make the real decisions.
The public are just spectators of action, quoting Walter Lippmann, allowed to ratify but not really interfere.
Exactly. The source argues elites see genuine popular democracy as a threat, so they use media and other institutions to control the public mind, distract people.
Marginalize real participation. It uses the historical example of businessmen sponsoring evangelical religion in the 19th century.
To divert workers from economic organizing, yes.
And the media is seen as part of a larger doctrinal system. Journals, schools, universities.
All representing, the source argues, the same basic interests as those in power. The media's main role is serving power, defending the agenda of privileged groups.
It really pushes back against the idea that mainstream media is liberal or adversarial to power.
Calls that idea itself corporate propaganda. It even quotes the business press calling the public mind the biggest hazard-facing industrialists.
It does acknowledge some changes over time, though. More access than, say, 40 years ago.
Yeah, partly due to people from the 60s entering the field, but stresses the fundamental issues of ownership and power remain.
Media owned by private tyrannies corporations. Limits on content.
Flexibility exists, but lines are drawn if content goes beyond the bounds owners will tolerate.
Popular culture gets analyzed, too. Spectator sports, some interactive tech, seen as tools.
To make people passive, atomized, obedient non-participants. Fostering jingoism, the gladiators model.
Examples like home shopping for women, sports stats for men.
Yeah.
Part of a marketing culture, not empowerment.
That's the argument. Designed to consume attention, promote passive consumption.
Another technique, personalizing events, focusing on Hillary Clinton, Tonya Harding, JFK.
To direct attention away from structural issues, policy matters.
And the media gets linked to the feeling that government is the enemy.
While obscuring, the source argues, the real power centers, those large, often international corporations, described as totalitarian institutions controlling the economy and setting the rules for government.
So democracy is often limited, managed. Media and other institutions act more as instruments of control than independent watchdogs, diverting attention from real authority.
Turning now to domestic issues. Crime, poverty, social control.
The source critiques the 1994 Clinton crime bill pretty heavily.
Focuses on its repressive aspects. 100,000 more cops, boot camps, prisons, expanded death penalty, federalizing gang membership. A huge jump in spending on incarceration.
With nothing constructive included.
That's the assessment. And it links this to broader trends. Economic polarization, marginalizing large parts of the population.
People becoming superfluous for the economy, having no market value.
Right. And this marginalization, the source suggests, breeds despair, irrational attitudes, violence, sometimes fueled by popular culture.
It presents a really harsh view of the jail system. Multiple purposes.
Managing the marginalized, concentrating them where they prey on each other, providing an economic stimulus shot in the arm through prison construction, and just reducing the number of superfluous people.
The war on drugs is called utterly fraudulent. Why?
Targets illegal drugs, less deadly than tobacco or alcohol, whose use was already falling. Allowed predictions of success.
And it highlights the targeting of poor and minority populations. Easier arrests in ghettos, Lots of jail time for little guys.
Yes. And here's where it makes that really controversial claim about the U.S. government's own role in drug trafficking.
Since WWII, linked to undermining anti-fascists, labor movements,
Ah.
like in France, impeding arms to Vietnam.
That's the example given. It goes so far as to call the U.S. government the world's leading drug peddler.
Citing historical support for narco-traffickers in the Golden Triangle, Latin America, Noriega back when he was an asset.
Mentions huge money laundering through U.S. banks, chemical shipments.
And the CIA isn't acting alone here, but as an instrument of state policy for plausible deniability.
That's the argument presented, not an independent actor in this context.
So crime and drug policies are viewed not as about safety or health, but control. And the government prosecuting the war is simultaneously implicated in the trade itself. That's quite the claim.
It is. Which brings us to the final part. Possibilities for change and resistance given this heavy picture.
It acknowledges the heaviness of the truth, right? But insists change is possible.
Yes, but only through constant, dedicated struggle.
It contrasts historical wins, civil rights, environmental laws, beginnings of healthcare with current efforts,
Right.
often just protecting those limited gains.
Arguing that protecting something won is still better than starting from zero. Progress was made.
But it emphasizes organization, collective action is absolutely key.
It says isolated individuals are basically powerless against concentrated power. Taking on the power company alone, impossible.
Exactly what unions are for, and political parties that are based on working people.
Right. Contrasting U.S. unions getting health care for members versus Canadian unions linked to Labour parties getting it for everybody.
It suggests exploiting existing openings even in a controlled system, influencing representatives.
Yeah, how's easier than Senate or president who's seen as immune and doing independent research?
Digging into original sources, NSC memos, not just summaries.
Right. And it cites public opinion polls showing a big disconnect. People thinking business has too much power, workers too little, system unfair, government works for the rich.
Showing dissatisfaction isn't reflected in policy.
It also discusses structural possibilities. Corporations are chartered by states. Legal mechanisms exist to revoke charters, put them under worker community control.
Not done in a century, but argues corporate rights could erode if challenged. Mentions Mondragon as a less totalitarian model.
Yes, and a key point. Don't wait for a charismatic leader.
Calls that a disaster, as it always has been. Change must come from popular action, participation.
And the framing of resistance, not speaking truth to power. Power knows. It's speaking truth to the powerless, or better, with the powerless.
So they act to dismantle illegitimate power.
Exactly. Acknowledges the challenges, despair, isolation, cultural barriers to action, but insists struggle is the engine of change.
It gives examples of community organizing. Brazil, Argentina.
Yeah, Nova Iguazu using clowns, skits, outdoor discussions on racism succeeding where academics failed. Mothers in Buenos Aires creating cultural centers, protecting kids from gangs, women doing the organizing. Contrasting this with mainstream media intellectuals.
Notes lively anarchist movements in Latin America,
Yeah.
sometimes pragmatically using the state.
Other groups like Witness for Peace, just human beings acting decently, touches on political correctness, sometimes focused on minuscule questions, ignoring bigger power structures. Mentions the Million Man March as complex, having positive community elements too.
And connects intellectual independence to libraries, access to information, worrying about trends like libraries stocking bestsellers, charging fees.
Seeing it as redesigning society for the wealthy, contrasted with Pentagon subsidies, attacks on academic freedom are part of this assault on independent thought.
So the analysis concludes that the struggle continues, adapting to new terrains, like the internet.
Yeah, the same fundamental conflicts over power and control will play out there too.
So this deep dive, drawn directly from the source material you provided, has really explored a perspective that's, well, deeply critical of how we usually understand global power, corporations, our economic and social systems.
It definitely challenges mainstream ideas of free markets and democracy, offering this view focused on concentrated power.
And just to reiterate for you listening, our purpose here isn't to endorse this viewpoint. It's about understanding this specific, significant intellectual analysis of how the world works, based on the historical record and patterns presented in the source material itself.
Absolutely. In a world just flooded with information, taking time to unpack material like this, to look beyond the usual narratives as the source pushes us to do.
It can be really valuable for broadening our understanding of how power dynamics might be operating, you know?
Indeed. The source suggests that while these power systems can seem overwhelming, maybe even designed to make us passive.
The potential for change ultimately rests with ordinary people, acting collectively, through organized struggle.
So given the profound challenges and the structures of power discussed throughout this material,
hmm
where do you see the most vital